are considered as explanatory frameworks that offer rival, comprehensive understandings of reality. Broad scientific theories that structure our understanding of a natural domain are developed over time in response to a variety of challenges. Likewise, I believe, to evaluate the competing merits of theism and atheistic metaphysical naturalism as comprehensive accounts of reality, we need to work through their implications in some details. Given that I have just 45 minutes and we're running a few minutes late, these remarks of mine will be programmatic. I will merely sketch some main issues that each of these two metaphysical theories needs to address before talking about the general form that arguments for and against each of them should take. On Tuesday and Thursday, I will illustrate the framework I am proposing by discussing two pairs of arguments, one pair for naturalism and one for theism. There, of course, are many other arguments. Sorry, here, let me do something on my screen. Okay. There, of course, are many other arguments. Though I am a theist, the goal of these three talks of mine is not to persuade you of the theoretical preferability of theism. I have a more modest goal, which is to recommend and briefly illustrate a certain way to approach this question. So you may, okay, sorry, I'm forgetting where my own slides were. So those were Tuesday and Thursday. So, all right, you may reasonably wonder whether this project that I'm engaged in is a viable one. After all, the question of naturalism versus theism is a metaphysical dispute concerning the nature of ultimate reality. And the main Western and Eastern philosophical traditions are all more than 2,500 years old. And they have been engaged in by some of the finest minds of every generation since that time. Is it time for metaphysics to admit defeat? Perhaps the human mind is not well suited to answering its questions. Or perhaps the questions themselves are defective in some way. Whatever the correct explanation of philosophy's abject failure, well, philosophers are critical to a point, and to a fault, I should say. And so such criticisms of central parts of philosophy have been aired by philosophers themselves. Some philosophical critics went on to construct systematic views concerning the nature of the human mind or language that purport to show us why all past constructive projects in philosophy to describe the nature of ultimate reality were misconceived or doomed to failure. They suggested, these critics, that the inevitable futility of metaphysics can be traced to the way the human mind interfaces with reality, or the conditions under which bits of language are rendered meaningful. But such views about language and mind-reality interface have proved to be just more disputed philosophical ideas, and also failed to be consistent with their own strictures to boot. So there is no neutral high ground from which we might hope to a consensus to be attained. Thankfully, the failure of metaphysics has been oversold. It's been exaggerated. It is simply not true that there has been no progress on these questions. While there may be no consensus around one systematic framework, there is a great deal of consensus on the implausibility of certain once popular ideas, on the superiority of modern elaborations or reconfigurations of older ideas to their original, cruder versions, and on the better ways to argue for contending modern positions. In short, the field of options has narrowed over time, and the surviving options are improvements over classical versions from which they have emerged. Foundational philosophical questions are indeed very difficult. The comparatively tractable questions it has asked in the past, some of the questions that we were able to make easier progress on, were offloaded to the sciences, which itself was a form of success. Philosophy and science for a long time were really fused together. What remains then in philosophy as we think of it today is the hard kernel, which is not amenable to decisive empirical resolution. Metaphysical disputes are best compared to the current boundaries of theoretical physics. Our best theory of the microphysical domain, the very small, known as quantum mechanics, and our best theory of the large-scale domain, the general theory of relativity, are both explanatorily powerful, excuse me, with much evidence in their favor, but they are mutually inconsistent. They cannot both be true. There are a lot of different ideas about how to unify them into one consistent framework, how to modify one or both theories in order to render them consistent, but this has proven very difficult for physicists. Furthermore, leading ideas introduce new perplexities, such as the suggestion, common to many of the ideas, that space and time might not be fundamental aspects of our world. Will we ever attain a unique, unified framework that answers all of our empirical questions about the physical world and is consistent with all relevant evidence? Maybe, maybe not. We have no guarantees, but it would be absurd to suggest that the history of physics has not been marked by dramatic progress since Galileo and Newton, let alone since Aristotle. Still, I do not wish to exaggerate philosophy's progress either. We can readily imagine a consensus forming around a grand unified theory in physics in 20 years' time, perhaps. No one remotely imagines something similar happening among philosophers. Meanwhile, philosophers have their sundry commitments, despite being aware of the pervasive disagreement among philosophers. Is this irrational? Well, before you give a quick answer to that question, consider that what we should conclude from persistent disagreement among informed inquirers in any area of inquiry, that question is itself a philosophical question. There is no science that tells you how to proceed in the face of disagreement. True, science in general tries to build community-wide consensus wherever it can, and particular sciences may with good reason impose norms concerning the kinds of conclusions that a scientist asserts in a scientific journal article. But scientists often have private opinions, sometimes strongly held, about matters that are currently in scientific dispute. Is this necessarily irrational? That is not my question for today, but I will simply say that it is not obviously irrational. Okay. Metaphysical naturalism. So to compare and evaluate metaphysical naturalism and theism, we need to say something about what these general worldviews are committed to and the particular challenges they face as comprehensive theories of reality. I will begin with naturalism. So metaphysical naturalism, to a first approximation, is a view of reality on which the cosmos that we inhabit constitutes all of reality. And its fundamental defining features are those that are ascribed to it in the mature physical sciences. We need something like this second clause to differentiate this view from religious monist views that ascribe very different fundamental features to the cosmos than the sort physical science posits. However, there's a problem with this definition, since physical science is not yet done, and so it is an open question what features will populate the inventory of a completed final physics, if we ever arrive at one. Those features might be very different from anything we currently envision. It's also an open question, well, whether physics will ever arrive at a true theory of the deepest structures of the cosmos. So the second clause here needs to be revised. Perhaps the best that we can say is that according to metaphysical naturalism, and we have this on your screen, the cosmos we inhabit constitutes all of reality, and its fundamental defining features, while currently unknown, are all, this is a bit loose, are all continuous with those that mature physical science now postulates, undergirding the known structures, subatomic particles and fields that are interacting in space and time. We know about those structures. And so whatever the fundamental features are, they have to undergird, support the structures that we do know about through quantifiable physical laws in much the way that particle physics undergirds or supports chemical structures. Okay, there is a lot packed in, potentially, to that word all that in our summary position statement for metaphysical naturalism. That word all is what turns a merely science-affirming outlook into a systematic worldview, or metaphysics. The sciences collectively seek to describe the cosmos and the principles that govern its unfolding at different levels of grain. But they are silent concerning any possible realities that transcend the natural order, such as a creator God, since they offer evidence for general dynamical principles, what we call natural laws, on the basis of a limited sampling of events in the world. They are also, the sciences are also silent concerning the possibility that there are very infrequent, non-regular natural effects of purely supernatural causes, what we call miracles. Finally, the sciences are also silent concerning whether there is a human destiny beyond the grave. Human biology plausibly puts constraints on what any such supernatural scenario of survival of death might involve, but with some imagination, I think, concerning the omnipotent power of God, we can perhaps see a way that the divinely enabled survival of death could occur within those biological constraints. But that science does not speak directly to these religious questions is indicated by the fact that many respected scientists affirm positive religious answers to these very questions, while being fully apprised of scientific results and well-entrenched theories. Okay. While metaphysical naturalism maintains that questions concerning the nature of the cosmos are properly answered first and foremost by appeal to well-established theories in the sciences, certain philosophical questions concerning the cosmos are not squarely addressed by any science, and so they must be treated as matters in which we seek the most plausible extension of the overall description of the cosmos that the sciences deliver. 4 such questions are especially pertinent to assessing the relative merits of metaphysical naturalism and theism. Okay, so there are four issues that the naturalist, the philosophical naturalist, has to try to answer, and science by itself will not provide the answer to these questions. The first I'm calling unity. So cosmology, our science of the large scale, describes the universe as vast and expanding, with something on the order of 10 to the 80th power subatomic particles, a vast, finite, but enormously large number of some subatomic particles. Is the universe simply a collection of a large number of little things grouped into a relatively small number of basic particle types? Or on this version of naturalism, if it's a mere collection, then the existence of each individual little thing and of space-time as the arena that those things occupy is as basic a fact as the existence of any other little thing. And the overall state of the collection is determined by the states and arrangements of the little things. This would be analogous to the way that the existence of a child's wooden block toy replica of some building is nothing over and above the existence and arrangement of the individual blocks. An alternative system view maintains that neither the elementary parts nor the whole universe is more fundamental. Here's whoops, excuse me, jumped ahead there. Yeah, so the second line here I'm now referring to. So this is an alternative way to say that, no, the universe really is a system such that the elementary parts are not more fundamental to the whole universe. Instead, those parts are interacting and interdependent elements of a unified whole. The identity of each part, you might say, is bound up with every other part. Okay, so that's one issue that the naturalist that's a choice point. The naturalist has to decide which way to go, the collection view or the system view. Here's a second issue, which philosophers term modality. So we assume, typically in everyday life and indeed in science, that various events that did happen might not have happened, and that in general things could have been otherwise than they in fact are. But some maintain that this common impression of contingency, as we put it in philosophy, is mistaken. They suggest that this sense of contingency, that things could have been otherwise, is an illusion resulting from the fact that we can never be aware of all the causes that led to each event in our own lives, let alone to some event, all the causes that led to some event in the past, that we can only imagine in very general terms. So imagine that in godlike fashion, we could see all the interlocking events at one stage of the cosmos' history, giving rise to the events comprising the next stage of that history, and so on through all of time. If so, subsequent stages of the universe might seem inevitable, like falling dominoes, And we might be led to conclude that your existence and my existence, rather than being contingent, was necessary. Well, at least conditional on there having been an initial start to the universe, a big bang, to get the whole sequence of dominoes going. Well, whatever the truth regarding the way our universe unfolds, whether it is strictly deterministic or instead is governed by mere probabilities, so allowing for multiple possible futures resulting from or evolving out of the very same initial event, or perhaps even nothing, not even anything non-physical at all. Or alternatively, is there something about our universe that renders it strictly necessary, such that it could not possibly have failed to be? Again, philosophers call this a question concerning the modal character of reality, where that just means that it's a bit of lingo to describe the terms contingent, necessary, actual, possible as modes of truth, or ways that a proposition may be true. So the question for the naturalist is whether it is more plausible to think the universe's existence is contingent or necessary. Science does not answer that question, and there are philosophical problems associated with choosing either option here for the naturalist. So I think this issue is a particular challenge for the naturalist. All right, third issue. The different sciences take up a domain of inquiry. For example, it might be human psychology, or cell biology, or chemical structure, or the fundamental physical forces that are operative everywhere. So each science takes up a different domain of inquiry and seeks to uncover the recurring features of the domain's objects or processes that make a difference to how those processes unfold. For example, chemistry identifies the elements by their mass and the number and configuration of their electrons. It then sorts them by general kind properties such as metal, right? Metal atoms or non-metal, and describes their interactions in the forming of molecules and in the interaction among molecules. But chemistry is silent on questions regarding the value of any such configurations. Is it good for there to be carbon? Are certain configurations more beautiful than others? Aesthetic value. And chemistry is silent on whether there ought to be any such things. This, of course, is not unique to chemistry. Even psychology aspires to become a science that can catalog and describe the wide range of mental states that we undergo in a way that illuminates the causal dynamics of the human mind. But it does so without weighing in on questions such as the goodness or badness, the beauty or ugliness of a given kind of mental state, or a kind of personal character, or whether in the final analysis one ought to engage in or refrain from a particular behavior or course of action. It's in addition to moral and aesthetic values and norms, it is important also to consider epistemic norms, norms of knowledge, or norms of rational belief that govern good reasoning and theorizing, such as deductive and inductive inference from evidence, right? These norms are obviously central to the practice of science and of philosophical reflection on science. So now the metaphysical naturalist is faced with a choice concerning the place of such values and norms, moral, aesthetic, and epistemic values and norms in our cosmos, as described by the sciences. Deny that there are such things, reduce them, try to show that in some way the norms and values are constituted by physical structures. This seems rather difficult, but that's a theoretically possible option. Or the third option is to simply accept them as fundamental features of reality in addition to physical reality, right? How is the naturalist to think about these kinds of entities? Since again, the guiding vision of naturalism is that the physical cosmos is fundamental reality, but these things don't seem easily identified with anything. Again, I say this is why they are peculiar, because we struggle to know how to characterize these abstract entities in intrinsic terms, but they play an important role in our thinking. And so basically, the naturalist again has three options. You can try to eliminate them. That's what the so-called nominalist does about properties, deny that there are shared properties among objects, say it's just an artifact of our language that we think there are such peculiar entities. Or the nominalists can try to reduce them to physical entities, or again, to just say, well, we have to complicate our picture of reality and say there is physical fundamental reality, but there's also abstract fundamental reality. And that's not a pleasing result for the naturalist, because you've got this bifurcation of fundamental reality. I'll just note, I don't have time to talk about this here, that some theists think that there's an advantage for theism because there is a theistic way of reducing abstract objects to something about the power of God or God's thoughts, right? Because God is omniscient. He thinks all truths. And if so, if one could successfully say there are numbers, propositions, properties, and possibilities, but these are these terms that we use ultimately refer to something about the nature, the power of God, or the actual thoughts of God, then we don't have to accept this additional realm of fundamental reality, of abstract objects that somehow peculiarly exist all by themselves. Okay, so, but that's a project for the naturalist to address. Let's now turn to theism. I will here take theism as accepting the naturalist's basic ontology, right? So we agree that there is physical reality, while theism adds to what the naturalist thinks exists. So in addition to the cosmos, there is a transcendent, immaterial, maximally excellent or perfect and personal reality that we call God. However, this is not a mere addition to the naturalist's ontology, for God is understood in such a way on material reality is seen as ontologically derivative and dependent reality. For many educated atheists, theism is seen as a static system of belief and is often taken to have crude implications for God's engagement with his creation. And of course, this perception is doubtless fostered by the somewhat crude conceptions that are voiced by many theologically unsophisticated theists. But like here's the point I want to emphasize, but like philosophical naturalism, theism has undergone theoretical development over time. We could go all the way back to ancient, in early human history, polytheism that preceded monotheism around the globe is on our best evidence. And then slowly monotheism emerged separately in the religious tradition of ancient Israel from which Judaism, Christianity, and Islam all spring to a significant degree, and it also emerged in certain strands of Hinduism and late paganism. In each case, each of these separate developments globally where theism begins to emerge, monotheism, belief in one God who transcends all of the cosmos, broadly philosophical reflections on what is required for being an appropriate object of worship, or an especially unconditional variety of worship, seems to have played an important role in this development. And once monotheism becomes rooted in various religious traditions, the nature of God continued to be debated, often in the context of authoritative religious texts, of course, within the different monotheistic religions. All right, but we should move on here. Theism, like naturalism, faces several conceptual issues that it needs to work out. Here, again, I will highlight just 4 of these. Theism, if God is conceived as an absolutely perfect reality, right? In some sense, that's the most fundamental way of characterizing God. God is the being than which none greater can be conceived, as the philosopher Anselm in the Latin West formulated. If God is a being who is absolutely perfect, we have to think about the logic of perfection. What does that mean? It's got 2 constituent concepts. Possibility. God is not just the thing that happens to be best. God is the best possible being. And then we have to say, okay, best means better than anything else. How do we understand these 2 constituent notions? There's some questions. I'm just going to quickly flip through some slides in the interest of time. Can we be confident in our judgments about ways it's possible to be? Theists need to think about this question. And then when it comes to God's being the best possible reality, some people are skeptical about the idea that there is an absolute notion of goodness, right? Rather than just, so it's good for a human being to have lungs, okay? If you're a human being, if you've got 2 well-functioning lungs, you are in some sense a better specimen of humanity than if you have only 1 lung or your lungs are not functioning well, right? But having well-functioning lungs is not a characteristic that would make a mountain better. It's only better than for a certain type of creature, a human being or a mammal. So what is the idea of something just being good as such? How do we compare the absolute goodness of things? That's what I'm getting at here in this second question. And then finally, some philosophers have been skeptical that if we can come up with a list of perfections, right? The attributes that it's absolutely better to have than not to have, maybe perfect power, perfect knowledge, perfect goodness. Is it possible for all those perfections to be had by one single thing? Are there certain incompatibilities among them? So that's an issue for the theists to address. There's also a question of unity for theism. God, of course, is understood to exist in complete independence of everything else. But since ancient Greek thought and on through the classical Jewish, Christian, and Muslim eras, God's independence, called his aseity, has been taken to imply that he is in no way complex. And this is a very perplexing doctrine. It says that God's power is identical to his goodness, is identical to his knowledge, and so on, and indeed is identical to God himself. There's no distinction between God's power and God himself. If you think about this idea, it would render God as utterly incomprehensible to us. We wouldn't we can't understand what it would be to say God's power and his knowledge and his goodness are in no way distinct, and indeed that God himself just is a simple reality. This has a lot of problematic implications that philosophers try to resolve. But another question is whether we could instead deny that God is absolutely simple in the way traditional theists have thought, and say God has unity, but a less radical kind of unity. That's a question. God has been traditionally thought to be timeless and therefore immutable, but is that compatible with his knowing an ever-changing reality? Right? Or might God in fact be in time in some sense, but in a perfected way that does not compromise his aseity? Finally, we suppose that God did not have to create our universe. He could have created some other universe or nothing at all. But is that consistent with his wills being perfectly rational? Can there be a rational explanation for why God chose this world if he might just as well have not created anything at all? Okay. Try very quickly here to end by saying something about what should be the proper form of arguments for naturalism or theism. I'm talking in a form in a very general sense. Historically, arguments for theism and occasionally arguments against theism, arguments for atheism, have been put forward as proofs. That is, deductive arguments that entail the conclusion God exists or God does not exist, and allegedly the premises are absolutely certain, beyond question. This style of argument, of course, is not the way that modern science proceeds. In modern science, evidence is put forward that, in the judgment of experts, renders an explanation or a theory more likely to be true than any known rival. That's all that is claimed. Such evidence comes in degrees, and it doesn't even have to be the case that all evidence points clearly in the same direction, just that the balance of such evidence, overall, the evidence points to the theory or the explanation. Since the late 1960s, Oxford philosopher Richard Swinburne has led other philosophers to conclude that arguments for and against theism should be thought of more like science, more like the way evidence is thought of in science, as providing varying degrees of weight, right, of evidence. I agree, and this perspective will inform the way that I discuss the two arguments for atheism on Tuesday and the two arguments for theism on Thursday. They are lines of evidence whose weight, of course, needs to be carefully examined, but then embedded within the wider range of evidence that comes from other considerations. There is no one conclusive, demonstrative argument for either metaphysical theory. I would add to this only that one way that very general theories earn their keep or are seen to be plausible is through the way they unify, right? Their explanatory unification. That is, the way they bring a variety of phenomena that used to be seen as wholly independent into a single unified framework of understanding. So the great 20th century biologist Fyodor Dobzhansky, who was also a Russian Orthodox Christian, famously said that nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution, the theory of evolution. What he meant by that was that evolutionary theory unifies and explains the variety and location of species across our planet and fossils, the bones of dead previous species, and the patterns that we see when we compare the anatomy and genetic code of different kinds of creatures, right? Evolutionary theory unifies and explains all that various data. Apart from the theory, Dobzhansky's point was, these can only be so many curious, coincidental, independent facts. In my view, a major part of the explanatory power of theism is precisely its power to unify our understanding of reality. Although I won't be able to fully develop this point in my upcoming talks, it will play a role in my discussion of the argument from normativity and value on Thursday. There's a complication, which of course is that most philosophical theists are also religious theists in one of the three Abrahamic religious traditions. And so therefore are committed to God's having specially interacted with human beings in particular times and places. These commitments in some ways add to the explanatory potential of theism. Those are my first two bullet points there. However, they also pose challenges to them. So this the upshot of this is that Pascal, the 17th century Christian philosopher, famously contrasted the God of the philosophers with the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So he saw a tension between philosophical conceptions of God and the way God was depicted in religious revelation. So there are challenges that have to be worked out. And of course, within each of these religious traditions, these challenges have been and continue to be addressed in different ways. How successful they are is something we can't consider here. So the consequence is we don't have one unified tradition, philosophical program of theism. We have really three distinct programs that are being engaged in by Jewish, Christian, and Muslim philosophers that partly overlap, but that are partly distinct. Okay, I will end there.